Let's move on to some counter-apologetics.
Hide your faith from the light of reason. It's now time for counter-apologetics.
Well, this is an update of sorts. So if you recall, back in episode 79, which is titled Porn, Politics, and Perfection, I presented an argument where I tried to show that the concept of the Christian God is an incoherent one.
Mm-hmm.
I did this by attempting to show a logical conflict between the ontological perfection of God and the very first intentional creation of some non-God item, and specifically the universe is what I was referring to. But it could be substituted for any non-God item. Now, one of the assumptions I was making here is that God is the only item in the set of things that exists that has always been in that set, that God is a necessary part of this set, and all else is contingent. So it went something like this. Back before any creation act happened, there was a time where God would have been everything, and this everything was absolute ontological perfection. And because at that time there was absolutely no distinguishing between God and some other item that exists. If this is the most perfect state, then it cannot be improved. However, it's often claimed that from this initial state, God intentionally created the universe. And we know that intentional actions require a desire, but how can you have a desire or preference for some ontologically better state of affairs exist in the mind of a being that is the most perfect state of affairs and cannot be improved? So if all existence is entirely composed of God, then you can't really have a desire exist. So I went on to address possible objections in that episode. One of the objections I pointed out was that my argument, or that other people potentially might point out, and actually they have. Whenever I use this is usually the first thing that pops up. They point out that my use of temporal language when referring to a time before...
Right. The land
God
before
created,
time.
Right.
Yes.
A time before time, essentially, is what I'm saying. That this doesn't make any sense, right? And that's why they can dismiss this argument, because they found a place where linguistically
it's an illogical, or it seems illogical to
right.
have. Yeah.
Right. And I dismissed this argument probably a bit too quickly by saying that, if God's actions are not influenced by prior desires, then God cannot be an intentional actor in any sense of the word. So whatever God's actions are, they fall outside the realm of understanding. So by going down this road, they must forfeit their right to even make the claim that the creation of the world was an intentional act. Whichever way you want to think about time, it's irrelevant to whether a desire could exist in a state of affairs where God exists and absolutely nothing else does. So I want to suggest that rather than an objection to my argument, this insistence on atemporal happenings leading to a temporal world presents an additional problem for the Christian theist, and it's actually not a problem for the argument. And, lucky for me, I was able to pose this question to Dr. William Lane Craig to find out if my objection to their objection is one with any merit.
You guys were hanging out at a coffee shop?
Yeah, we were, me and Craigie were hanging out.
The coffee shop before time.
Isn't that a Douglas Adams book?
It should have been. If there was any justice in this world.
That's right.
We should point out that William Lane Craig is one of his special areas of focus is time issues within philosophy and metaphysics.
That's a weird area of expertise to have, I have to say. But good for him for having it.
Someone's got to do it, right?
Yeah, right.
So there's a podcast that I subscribe to that I would actually recommend for our listeners as well if they don't already know of it. It's called Unbelievable. This is a podcast by Premier Christian Radio, and it's hosted by Justin Brierly. Premier Christian Radio is actually organizing a lecture and debate series with William Lane Craig over the next few months in the UK, and so many were given the opportunity when he was on the show recently to post pose questions and he would answer them on the air. So I got my opportunity to pose a question. And here's the audio of, this is Justin Brierley reading my question and Craig's response.
Aspect of the argument that people wanted to question was the whole issue of whether causation makes sense when we're talking about a time before time-space began. And so, for instance, Justin Schieber asks, Dr. Craig, it sure seems that intentional actions require a temporal realm. A desire, which is the motivation for a given action, must be prior to and be causally related to that action if it is to be considered an intentional one. This seems like it would be a pretty standard view. But if time itself has not always existed, but is among the things being brought into existence, it seems to run into a difficulty. This suggests that God has a desire prior to time existing that causally leads to an eventual action. Does it make sense to speak of events being before or after each other without time actually existing yet? Does it make any sense to say that God has created space-time intentionally? What do you say to that, Bill?
It does not make sense to speak of events being before and after each other with time out not actually existing. Before and after are temporal relations. So if you say that you have a before and after, you clearly have time. The question then is, does it make sense to say that God has created space-time intentionally, even though he's not chronologically prior to the beginning of the universe? And I think it does. I don't think that intentional actions require a temporal realm, as Justin seems to think. There's no reason that intentions and the actions that are the result of those intentions couldn't be simultaneous. For example, think of someone who is dangling off of a cliff, hanging onto a tree root to avoid falling. He intends to hold on to that root as firmly as he can, and his intentions are not chronologically prior to the action of fastening his hands around the root. They're simultaneous. So there simply isn't any need to have a chronological priority of intention to action. I think what is prior is a kind of explanatory priority. He holds on to the root tightly because he doesn't want to fall. So there is an explanatory priority of intention to action, but it doesn't need to be a chronological priority. So similarly, I think God can have a timeless intention to create a world with a beginning, and when he does create the world, then I think that is the moment simultaneously at which time comes into existence.
Well, I hope this is already testing your brain if you're listening. It certainly is mine, and we're taking some of the toughest questions.
It's not my fault, Justin. It's the questions,
absolutely.
you know?
Here's my response. I wrote a response.
Right, so he answered your question on the air, and you fired off a response back because his answer was not...
Right. On the very next episode, and usually at the tail end of the episodes, they have email responses. And so he was gracious enough to put my response up on there.
Justin Schieber was one of the people whose question I asked, and he says, Craig's response to my question on time and intentional action was an interesting one. Craig doesn't believe that intentional actions require a temporal realm, which of course is important in the sense of if God intended to produce the universe, does that make sense in the context of there not being any time before the Big Bang? But you say he thinks that intentions and the actions that are a result of those intentions could possibly be simultaneously. He asks us to think of a person dangling from a cliff hanging onto a tree root to avoid falling. He claims that the intention to hang on to the root exists simultaneously with the action of grasping onto the root. Now, I actually think Craig is absolutely correct. However, I don't think it helps his case. It seems that Craig is not making an important distinction here. Firstly, one kind of intentional action is something to the effect of, I want to act to change something about the state of affairs, and another kind of intentional action is something to the effect of, I want to maintain the current state of affairs. Now, that second kind of action could be properly understood as having the action and the desire as being simultaneous, but it seems that the creation of the universe was the first kind of intentional action, which does require a temporal realm as it needs chronological priority. So you felt that his answer didn't solve the problem that you were asking.
What do you guys think about that?
I think you got it perfectly. I
agree
thought
with
that
that.
was Craig was weaseling out of that, and he needs to assume a temporal order before you even get into that position of dangling from the tree. And
Right.
It was just clearly he was trying to show one instance of intention and action being somewhat
Although
simultaneous.
I was going to say we can't really say they're simultaneous because of the. I mean, we're talking speed of thought here.
Yeah.
They're very close to simultaneous if we're looking at a clock, but if we're looking at neurons, they're not.
I agree, Dave.
I'd probably retreat from that statement, like saying that I absolutely agree. I think there is some.
I think you
got
to play the apologist game to some degree to actually
so
get to the relevant
just,
challenge.
Even if I allow that, he's still ignoring a critical distinction. So his analogy is a false analogy.
Right.
If taken seriously, it kind of suggests, if we take that analogy literally and apply it to Craig, it kind of suggests that Craig believes that God has just always been maintaining the universe and never actually started the process of creating it ex nihilo.
Right.
Just as a man maintains his grasp upon the root. But Craig's Kalam argument clearly shows that, this is not at all Craig's view.
Mm-hmm.
So that can't be it. His insistence upon the possibility of simultaneous relationships between desires and actions does absolutely nothing to justify atemporal causation in terms of beginning to create ex nihilo. This kind of intentional action would fall under a changing of the state of affairs, not merely a maintenance of it. And changing would require language like before and after, because you would need a desire to motivate later on an actual change of affairs. Yeah, so it would be before and after in the sense that a man, if he desires to live, will then reach out and begin grasping onto the root after he's had the desire to survive and realize the predicament that he needs to act quickly in, right, that he's falling from a cliff.
Right.
So if God has an internal disposition to create the world, it must be non-simultaneous. There must be some kind of tension that exists between a desire and a state of affairs. That God wants a universe, however, there is no universe. He must recognize that and then act as to fix that. So it seems that the most popular attempt to dethrone my initial argument, when clarified, actually is just another point against the theist. It illuminates yet another huge problem for God's intentional creation of the universe. Now, if God's creation of the universe was not intentional, the universe exists completely without intrinsic purpose.
So he hasn't responded to you.
Well, I posted this on his Facebook. I know this
you're
is the program.
Facebook friends with William Lane
totally
Craig?
am.
That's awesome.
Does he have any party pictures?
And and he interacts pretty regularly on his Facebook.
Yeah. Not to this though.
But not to this. And I don't want to make any assumptions, but it just hasn't happened yet. So.
Do you intend to create the Facebook, or did it just pop into existence?
Well, it happened at the same time.
Oh.
Yes.